Okay, so the first image is Androgyne III, which is how Google said to pronounce it, so that's how I'm pronouncing it. And it's from Magdalena Bakanowicz, and she's Polish. The medium used in this image is burlap, resin, wood, nails, and string, and it was made in 1985, and it's 4 feet tall, and it's labeled as Neo-Expressionism. In terms of the form, the burlap is manipulated into a figurative composition, which means that it was meant to appear rough and coarse, which you can see on the back of the image, which I believe also could be a sign that she was trying to use her emotions and everything that she went through during World War II and how she had to battle the regimes of the Soviets and the Nazis, and how she used her emotions to explicate that through the coarse back and the lines and the wrinkles and stuff like that. And then it's abstracted, simplified, dramatically reduced, and hollow with no head, forearms, or shins. And it is a sculpture in the round, which we view from the back, but the front is very hollow, but that's also part of the image. It's meant to be like that because it's supposed to be part of like the sculpture, if that makes sense. And it used a mold process to make the form out of burlap with resin to stiffen it. And then the reason that this is Neo-Expressionism is because it's a return to the body and the expressive capabilities of the body. So it's believed that this has been lost in pop art, but it came back through this as it rejected the modernist attitude that the body is dead. And then the style is a revival of Expressionism as it's rough and jagged. So the style of this is a revival of Expressionism, which is maintained through the rough, jagged handling and sharp form seen throughout the image, which is very prevalent on the back, as well as the kind of wooden figure that holds up this person. And going into the function, it examines the relationship between individual and community, along with juxtaposing the idea of isolation and loss. And this, again, was very influenced by World War II, as this image and most of her other images were very influenced through what her family went through during this time in Warsaw, Poland. And it shows the dehumanization and lack of identity that are the result of strife, war, anguish, and derision. Again, because she firsthand experienced this, which I'll get into later in context. And it shows the vulnerable human identity in a modern world. And it, again, depicts isolation and loss in a universal way, so we can kind of relate to this in a way. And even though we can't identify this figure specifically and we see so little of it, we kind of recognize with it and relate to it in a way that it shows it the plight that this person went through. And then another thing is that it kind of communicates this idea that destruction leaves us as a shell of who we once were, as this image looks like a shell. If you see an image that I'm going to put in later in this video on how the other side of this image is essentially a shell because it's kind of carved out is what it looks like. I'll just show you later because it's kind of hard to explain. This goes along with the idea of the dehumanization, as destruction leaves us as a shell of who we once were, because it takes humanity away from society. So as I was saying earlier, how this image communicates the idea that destruction leaves us as a shell of who we once were is shown through the front of the image, as it doesn't really portray something to look at, but more like a hollow inside of what the backing is. And then in terms of content, it's an androgynous figure which focuses on humanity rather than gender, and I feel like that's really important, especially because she's a female, and I feel as though a male artist maybe wouldn't try to communicate this and maybe make the gender more prevalent, but she does this more to unite society as a whole rather than divide it through gender. And then it has wrinkled skin, a backbone, and musculature with veins and missing limbs. And then another thing is that it was elevated from the floor by a wood structure as a base. So this could either be filling in legs or even a wheelchair maybe through... Alright, so the first image is image 217, the female deity from Nukuru people from Micronesia, and it's 16 inches long, and it was made out of wood, with it being made in the 18th to 19th century, so the 17th to 1800s. And the form is that the surfaces were smoothed with this material called pumice, which is a light and porous volcanic rock, which was readily available on the beach because Nukuru was actually a atoll, I think that's what it's pronounced like, on the island of Micronesia. And all of the figurines that are similar to this have very, very similar proportions and characteristics, including an ovoid head that tapers at the chin, a columnar neck, and eyes and noses that are very discreet or basically not shown at all, shoulders that slope downward, breasts that indicate or the breasts that are indicated by a simple line, and then a butt that's very flattened and set on the legs. And so in terms of function, the main purpose of this was it was a fertility figurine placed in temples. It was often highly decorated with feathers, paint, and headdresses, and it occupied an important role in fertility ceremonies, being seen as the beginning of the harvest for bananas, sugarcane, and coconut. During the festival, harvested foods were brought to the wooden figurines as offerings, and dances were performed, and women were tattooed. So it was a very important thing in this society and culture. And during these rituals, the figurines were considered to house gods or ancestral spirits, so that way it could be kind of a connector for the humans on Earth and their spirits and ancestors for the people before them. And in terms of content, it's just a fertility figurine, which explains the emphasis on the body parts. And each figurine represented a specific deity, which was then associated with a particular temple, priest, or family group, though it's not known which one this represents. So in terms of context, the Nauru was a small isolated atoll on the archipelago of the Caroline Islands that were inhabited since the 8th century, so around the 700s. And in 1806, the Spanish navigator Monteverde was the first European to sight the land. And in 1830, 400 inhabitants traded with the Europeans, and we know this from a presence of metal tools. And in 1850s, American missionaries arrived there. In the 1870s, European trading posts were established, which also in 1870, the European trading posts did offer a strong linkage between Europeans and the indigenous peoples of this land. But sadly, in 1913, many pre-Christian traditions, such as dance, song, artwork, and stories, were lost due to the missionaries colonizing the land. So it was kind of hard for me to find a connection just because these two images offer many parallels, but I did say that they can be compared as they both touch on the subject of gender. Androgyne III explicates the idea of seeing people as humans rather than solely based off of their gender. This is executed through the piece only showing the back and nothing that can indicate being a female or male. The female deity also touches on the subject of gender as it glorifies femininity through the emphasis on. So the female deity shows gender as it glorifies femininity through the emphasis on its role in fertility ceremonies by really pointing the direction of the audience viewing it towards the things important in fertility ceremonies, and that kind of can be compared to the other one as there's nothing indicating anything based off of gender, which in a way does touch on the subject.